Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm going to speak quite a bit tonight about collaborative aspects of architecture and architectural thinking, and it's already been quite a collaborative effort just to get up here tonight, so thank you very much for those kind introductions. If I can turn, does this light down here work so I can see this thing? We can have the lights, and I'll just launch into this.
Would you like to light off?
Yeah, please. Can you guys see that all right? Yeah, better. Oops, let me turn this down. Okay. I've titled tonight's talk Ambient Formalism. Ambient Formalism, the multiple realities of what we could call distributed architectures today. And I've divided the talk into four, I think, fairly straightforward and clear parts, each around a slightly different concept of architectural form today, and I think many of which were touched upon in some of the talks and discussions earlier today. The first part, electronic form, the idea of form as an ambient property of installations and spaces. The second one, parametric form, and the kind of forms that are a result of today's parametric design systems that all architects are now working across. The third one I've called a distributive or distributional form, the relational aspects of how we collaborate and think, which is the final topic of tonight's talk, what I'll call collaborative form, and the kind of forms that could really be associated with this kind of an image, which isn't in fact a picture of the AA, although it feels very much like what being there most days is, the management of a fairly complex crowd of strong individuals. In fact, it's quite a famous photograph by Andreas Gursky of a kind of intelligence, formal organization, and structure that really exists across what you could call properties of large numbers. Crowds, aggregations, emergent properties that are really possible through the way in which individuals within a crowd, rather than individuals themselves, are organized or formed. How do I make it go forward? Anybody know? Do I just use the mouse? Let's see. I have no idea. I have no keyboard here. No, you don't want that one. Here, this one. Try this. Yeah, okay. Image one. A first image showing something of the stereotyped image and consequences of today's computational setting for the transformation of not only the ideas of architectural form, but as well the form of architects' own bodies, which many see being changed like his or her thinking in sometimes grotesque ways. The kind of context that I think today's collaborative ideas of architectural form are emerging out of. Settings in which the designer is no longer that person in this image, but the aggregate setup of a distributed electronic design system, which we refer to sometimes as computers, operating systems, software applications, that the architect works in very strange and peculiar ways within today, in ways that other people have remarked is in fact changing the very bodies that we think of as that of the architect, as they spend their lives in front of these machines, move around less, and start to in fact resemble architecture in its own peculiar ways. How architects are working today has changed dramatically in recent years, and in many ways very different than first imagined when these systems initially appeared. On the left is an image I took of one of my students in the year 2001. On the right is Stanley Kubrick's image of what 2001 was supposed to look like when he made the film in 1968. That somehow the kind of elaborate, complex network systems would be the realm of specialists like astronauts in outer space, and in fact have evolved into very everyday, ordinary pieces of furniture that we all now live with in our lives as architects. The most interesting aspect of this change in contemporary electronic reconfiguration is that of design itself, which has become something greater than the appearance of the architect's own body or tools, and in ways has become the individual architect embedded within larger information spaces and operating systems. A couple of images of that architect not as an individual, but now as an individual increasingly within these very strange self-organizing entities we refer to as design teams today. Interestingly, those teams, as I showed in that first diagram, always tend to feature these strange artifacts like computers or networks which connect those individuals together while they're working. This talk tonight will focus on a contemporary architectural formalism that is both an output of as well as a sensibility resulting from work within today's increasingly distributed design systems. These, in turn, are existing now within expanding electronic envelopes of design tools, communication media, and machinic production technologies that create a new kind of informational ecology within which all architectural work and thought now exists. It has, I think, its own kind of formal structures and expectations, and there are expectations that are beginning to inform how architects actually talk about form itself. First, though, let me clarify what I won't be talking too much about tonight. The kinds of form we associate with discrete projects in architecture. I'll inevitably touch on this, of course, and in fact I do quite a great deal of lecturing on that topic of how the form of individual projects exists today, but I'm much more interested tonight to contribute to the discussion in the different kind of form, which is, of course, that of the form of how it is we organize our own work routines as architects. And these are routines that I think that have undergone a fairly dramatic reconfiguration in recent years. Within my recent working life at the AA, on the left, architecture studios not so long ago looked pretty familiar in terms of the history of modernism. On the left is a bright, airy, flexible space that I think Walter Gropius would have recognized as a studio. Over 3 or 4 years, that space was converted into this sort of strange, dark, dangerous cave of people jammed together, no longer looking at teachers, but staring at a series of screens that have completely reconfigured the actual form of the studio that we were doing our work within. That transformation, which for us occurred over about a 3-year period in London in the late 1990s, is the backdrop for what I'll be showing tonight. That transformation, of course, is now extending in slightly different ways so that the original networked machines that sit within the studio now, of course, connect to this new generation of machines which are producing the physical models that are being extended out of the drawings and the diagrams that those teams are configuring. Tonight's talk, Ambient Form, I've given as a title a concession to the electrical infrastructure that architecture, like many other design disciplines, now quite literally depends upon for its own livelihood. Today, this electrical informational infrastructure in architecture is extending itself into architects' working lives in ways that reconfigure not only architectural ideas of form, but as well architecture itself. The formal organization and operative demands of electrical networks within design studios today profoundly challenges, I believe, modern no less than classical attitudes about what form-making operations consist of. Traditionally, formalism in architecture denotes an emphasis on the composition, structure, and organization of individual architectural singularities. Isolated and one-off projects, self-contained design processes, individual and often very proprietary design personalities and methods, discrete building parts, and individual material systems. In contrast, and in modern times, what it is we might call form, however, has expanded to increasingly include immaterial informational domains. So on the left, a kind of classical conception of form in which architects or urbanists think of the material of the city as dead, inert matter that simply piles itself up over time into a stable form. On the right, the kind of expansion of the material of the world that occurs in the early 20th century in this photograph by Eric Mendelsohn in Times Square, where the electrification of the city obviously extends what it is we might think of as the form of that city. What Mendelsohn and others discovered in their first trips to America was suddenly a city animated by the flowing of energy and not just the matter that shaped the particular shape of that square. What architects these days might call the material of architecture is a more complex and open-ended task owing to the arrival of mediated and informational domains now as real and certainly as pervasive as other more natural aspects of our world. This has been the case, of course, for a long time and certainly much longer than the heralded arrival of what everybody now calls the information age, which is one of the reasons I pulled this image out on the right. This is the 1930s in New York, a first kind of modern sensibility grasping this many, many decades ago, and certainly long before things like computers were invented. Classical architectures or theories of architecture have relentlessly pursued attitudes of form focusing on the arrangement of inert matter. Today, new kinds of architectural multiplicities pursue inherently connective, dynamic, and continuous structures. And there are three obvious kinds of formal multiplicity today which architects confront as a part of their daily lives. And this will provide the structure for some of the images I'll be showing in the talk that follows. First of all, there's collaborative multidisciplinary design teams. These exist alongside network structures, spaces, and institutions today. And there's the parametric design and manufacturing systems through which design ideas are developed. All of these are a kind of multiplicity of formal structures and never singular, discrete, self-contained entities. In what follows, I'd like to briefly show how each of these conditions are affecting the formal structures of not just what architects produce, but as well how they configure their work routines and the spaces within which that production takes place. These are the spaces that already have, for all of us, I think, today, a few familiar features. In fact, those features are often, in most architects' mind, the kind of images on the left that I'm showing here, the sort of junk spaces of today's everyday and kind of routine wiring of the world all around us. The stuff that architects typically pay little attention to, but which provides the actual backbone for presentations like the one that's going on now, all of the kind of wiring and systems that make it possible for me to do what I'm doing here. A recent electrification of the architect's design studio is only the latest iteration of a technological feat of wiring and connecting the world that has for a long time been an essential feature of cities and their infrastructure. And for my purposes of the talk tonight, the actual invention of architectural modernism. Infrastructures are a key aspect of what it is we take to be modern, not only in architecture, but most other aspects of our lives. Circulatory systems especially can be seen to have been the essential aspect of the history of cities and their synthetic geographies. They are a feature of the material world emulated by modern architects upon their original invention of architecture, reinvention in the early 20th century, and is probably most clearly seen in modern architects' obsession with the organization of circulation spaces, as they call it, as the kind of viable infrastructure around which buildings and cities have been formed. Throughout the 20th century, architects have tried vainly to contain, if not outright constrain, a proliferation of modern networks of all kinds. I've got a few examples of architects' obsessions with trying to constrain this phenomenon of our world. Maybe the most famous example on the left, an architect like Louis Kahn, who had a deep, deep fear of ductwork and service spaces to the point that he coded them and put them in a separate space from what he called the lived public space of architecture itself. Those two realms, in his view, couldn't interact with one another and shouldn't. In the center is an office plan in New York in the mid-20th century, and the kind of example of core thinking that again tries to constrain the proliferation of networks to one key central core and literally hide it within the figure or the form of architecture. And on the right, a more recent version of the same kind of obsession with constraining networks. The architect Richard Rogers' plan for the Lloyd's building in London, finished in the early 1980s, in which he in fact reverses that diagram in the center and throws all of the service networks and structures to the outside of the building and tries to reinvent them as a form of architectural ornamentation. But again, in carrying forward the obsession with containing these spaces, keeps them separate from the stuff that we would normally call the architectural space of the floor plans of that office building. More recently, I think you can start to see in an image like this the way in which the proliferation of these networks is literally weighing down what it is we call architectural space itself. It's a photograph I took in an airport in Germany a few years ago, in which you can see the architectural space is about 25% of the image, right? What we would call the public space of this structure is literally being weighed down by meters and meters of ductwork, electrical engineering, structural networks, all of which provide the backbone, the actual material for creating that space. And it's that kind of compression of a classical definition of public space, which is one of the most interesting consequences of this modern proliferation of networks and technologies of all kinds. The architects are getting kind of pushed out of the picture, like the people running through Stuttgart Airport most days of the week. The electrification of our world began in the 19th century owing to the invention of the modern research lab, itself the product of the imagination of someone like Thomas Edison, who invents the prototype of a modern research and development facility in New Jersey in the late 19th century. Edison's invention of electrical infrastructures quickly spread from his lab to the city itself, most famously when he electrifies Manhattan on Canal Street in the early years of the 20th century. And of course it spreads from there across not just that city, but all cities throughout the world. More recently, and alongside that urban proliferation, of course, those infrastructures have worked themselves back into spaces like this one tonight and the actual architectural interiors through which we all live and work. A few examples of that slow accretion of electrical infrastructures within architectural space. You can make it out in that kind of line of lamps that starts to appear in things like libraries. In architectural studios, the same sort of thing happens. This is a photograph of my school in the 1950s. You can see the first creeping evidence of these infrastructures slipping into the architect's working routines. This is that same space, actually, I photographed a year ago, several decades later, not so different, really, in its physical structure. The lamps have been raised up a bit higher. The strange addition, of course, is that object in the center of this picture, which I'll be talking more about in the next section. There are extreme forms of this penetration of electrification within design studios and thinking. This is a photograph I sneakily took on the 53rd floor of an office building in Tokyo, where 80% of all of your mobile phones are produced today. These are the designers sitting at their workstations, having been handed a job by a central server somewhere in the tower. As they sit down, an RFID tag is read on their jacket, and that tag carries the information that lets the computer know what their skill sets are. It automatically throws a job up on the screen. They work for the rest of the day and then go home at night. It's a fairly scary kind of extreme version of where this sort of assimilation is going. A more ordinary example of that proliferation within our studios today, a couple of photographs on the right of my students working wired into this space of the architect's design studio today. The arrival of computational technologies usually leads to a discussion of these kind of artifacts within an architect's working life. The interesting thing is to see how those are being surpassed by this larger proliferation of peripheral devices of various kinds, all of which are cabled and connected to one another and to the individual team members within these kind of settings. Two architectural schools from the early 20th century and early 21st century. On the left, Robinson Hall at Harvard University, which in the early 20th century copied the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, created a space of artifacts for architects to learn from through direct study. On the right, the replacement of those kind of artifacts with the sort of servers and hubs that now carry a very different kind of information, but essentially operate in the same kind of way. The distribution of information and knowledge occurs through the connection between a space and the setting it provides for different objects that we learn from. It is from within their own working spaces that architects literally make form. It is nearly the definition of architectural activity that architects formalize ideas and the constraints they're presented with in the arrangement of space, structure, and materials out of which those things we refer to as architectural projects are realized. 3 images from a project I think you all probably know, the Seattle Public Library, completed by OMA a few years ago, just to show this example of this formalizing of material around information. A well-known diagram of the design team's early work on the structure. On the left, the program they're presented with from the client, their attitude about how to reconfigure that arrangement of spaces that are needed in such a way that they then have the basis for a diagram for organizing the structure of the building itself. A kind of processing of information that achieves this thing we would call form at the end of the day, and an image of the actual building that comes out of that sort of a process. Much as it is for other kinds of cultural production, a concept of form is very useful to understand a given designer or project, at least in relation to its larger disciplinary context. It's something I'm doing here specifically tonight in relationship to one distinct aspect of our larger architectural world, that of the new and rapidly evolving design tools and systems that we're all now working with. All architectural innovation and change can be grasped through the corresponding attitudes about form, order, and structure in building that the tools we work with make possible and push us through. This kind of formalizing of information and ideas is the sort of thing we see in the history of architectural diagramming itself. These are very competing and different visions about what form constitutes in architecture, most certainly, and in fact some of it's generational. The famous Venturi definition of form as the expression of a statement literally in the signage and appearance of a building versus the kind of form that's the outcome of machinic design operations like Eisenman's house in the upper right, or the same kind of banded programming strategy done by OMA in their Lavalette project in the early 1980s. Another example of this kind of argument about the idea of architecture or architectural design being the formalizing of information. And again, to try and not show just a contemporary version, but something within the history of modernism itself, this is Hannes Meyer's famous Peterschule competition board he submits in 1920s, in which he tries to make a mockery of all of the design constraints that he was presented with in Berlin at that time, all of the various planning diagrams and requirements, which he literally just reproduces on the competition board itself and says, look, there's no space left for design. What you guys really need is a monument to the requirements themselves. One board competition entry, which didn't go very far in the competition. It is the new formalism of today's younger experimentalists that reveals something of the limits as well as the potentials of today's computational design systems. They reveal as well, I believe, a great deal about the enduring feature of formalism itself within architecture, which is carried through diagrams, commentary, and communication in formal diagrams like these. And when one of my teams on the right produced an image several years ago, an early generation of modeling software that made these kind of continuous surface projects possible, for me one of its most striking features is the way in which it carries forward formal attitudes that in fact already are embedded deeply within the discipline. On the left is Korb's famous Maison Domino diagram of the 1920s, in which he offers the modern prototype of what a house can be. Something that can be stripped down to 3 distinct infrastructures which simply interpenetrate one another. The horizontal slabs of undifferentiated floor space, the vertical columns that carry all of the structural loads in the system, and if you can see it in the back, the independent circulation system that doesn't need to interact with either of those. Effectively, all 3 are carried forward in a diagram like this, and the only real difference is, of course, that those are embedded as a continuous feature in one operation. Slabs that can fold and connect different levels, forces that can be carried through that folding, and still undifferentiated, uninterrupted floor space that can be inhabited. One can observe comparisons that play out in other ways, and even within the body of an individual architect's work. from the early 20th century, Le Corbusier's very strange version of what Rome looked like to him, which are those peculiar pure geometry figures up at the top of that image, which tend to emphasize discrete independent objects. A few years later, in his own work, a conversion of that attitude of urbanism towards the idea of network space itself. This is an example of the 1930s cities that he was planning, in which, again, the superimposition of an infrastructural network becomes a dominant kind of organizational principle. Within Korb's own work, in fact, there's an incredible history, first in his sketchbooks and later in his projects, of an obsession with infrastructure as an organizational principle in architecture. These are his odd comments being written about the proliferation of freeways in the early 20th century, which he eventually assimilates into his own work through the making of projects like this one, the Carpenter Center in Harvard, which is built around its own kind of internal road system. Infrastructure becomes a kind of architectural space, and not the other way around. In recent digital architectures, we can observe a fascinating convergence between that of the rise of a newly networked design system and the revival of formalism as a discrete and focused interest. I don't think this convergence is entirely one of coincidence, regardless of how new this condition still appears to us today in 2008. And I always like to use an image like this to remind us of how fast this stuff is evolving. This is what our design systems looked like 15 years ago. This is Windows version 1.0, in which the kind of graphic tools and operations that we had, of course, were of a very different kind of palette that allows us the moment at which we can watch the emergence of these kind of interests. It's only been a little over a decade, for example, since computer systems were actually able to link and talk with one another. If you remember, Windows 95, launched in 1995, was a system that was unable to link two computers together very reliably. That was a separate system called NT, which became the backbone of all the systems that we use today. Over this past decade, many of the forms associated with the first generation of digital architecture have been quickly converted into near cliches. We've witnessed an obsession with blobs, curves, and continuous surfaces of all kinds, all of which aren't alien or unfamiliar forms of architecture so much as they are defamiliarized forms of stuff that already exists within our discipline. That was the point of that earlier example that I showed of the Maison Domino. For Victor Shklovsky and other early modern formalists, defamiliarization of form is one of the key principles of how it is we can learn and then transform the world as it already exists. This was as well an influencing aspect of the invention of modern architectural pedagogies themselves at schools in the early 20th century, like this one, which is, of course, the Bauhaus. A very strange postcard that a student at the Bauhaus sent his parents, kind of indicating where everybody is working in the building. We need to recall, for example, that it was the industrialization of new building materials, glass and steel, that was used by Van de Velde, Gropius, and others to argue for the creation of an entirely new, modern, and experimental form of teaching and learning architecture. It was so extreme, this sentiment, at a place like the Bauhaus that we need to remember that between 1919 and 1926, Gropius refused to allow the teaching of architecture of any kind within the school. In fact, it was students' protests in 1926 that they wanted to be taught architecture that got him thrown out and Hannes Meyer brought in as his successor. Gropius argued for a principle in which architects and students would spend their times in the workshops in this building, experiment with new materials, and out of that develop ideas that would eventually become a new architecture. This is Gropius's famous diagram of how the curriculum at the Bauhaus was organized. Conveniently, architecture at the center of the universe, but all teaching would be organized around the periphery of that figure in the various workshop spaces and faculties that dealt with new media and new technology. This is the diagram that Hannes Meyer presented in 1926 of how to reorganize that space. It looks a great deal like a Hannes Meyer building, in fact. That in fact spoke about the rewiring of faculties in relation to one another as a more productive form of teaching and learning architecture. A century after the Bauhaus, however, their revolutionary impetus needs to be put in perspective in relation to our own and, I think, much larger forms of change that are being negotiated today. A generation of architects today is living through, for the first time ever, not simply the industrialization of new building materials used in their designs, but rather design systems themselves, which have recently been industrialized and globally distributed in the form of a small number of dominant software applications linked among computing platforms and work routines that have now transformed the way, of course, we all live and work. Just as was the case a century ago with the arrival of new materials, form again has become an important and vital topic to try and reassess how it is we think of architecture. We do that in a strangely episodic form in architecture. We do it one project at a time. Our knowledge of architecture and this pile of books that records the career of someone like Korb or Mies is organized in the form of architectural knowledge itself, literally one project after another. How we work on projects defines what it is we know about not just those projects, but architecture itself. Obviously, as those tools change, so changes our knowledge of what it is we take to be architecture. How we do that today, of course, is through parametric platforms used to make models, informational as well as material, that deeply embed connections and links between the various parts and pieces making up a project, a design, or a diagram. This parametric dimension of architecture today is another topic to look at in relation to architectural form. Architectural form, or what you could say relational attitudes of architectural form. The actual work we do as architects is a highly symbolic form of information processing. Architects that take the physical, material, and spatial requirements, their own ambitions, their clients' needs, they mix these together and transform them into proposals or structures that concretize their project. It's a form of computation. It's a form of informational processing. It's a diagram one of my students did of the various kinds of file types his team was keeping track of over the evolution of a project during 16 months. The dozens of different systems that the ideas of their project were traveling through at different stages in its development, in which the mastery of individual platforms no longer matters as much as your ability to choreograph how information moves within these larger, more complex systems. How architects conceive and test formal ideas has long been dependent upon specific tools that make some and sometimes entirely new forms and forms of thinking possible. A couple of images here of the work Robin Evans did to try and track the development of Baroque architectures through development of technologies like stereometric projection, in which the double curvature of that surface is suddenly visualizable because of techniques that architects and others developed for describing and drawing such forms. Evans' career as an architectural historian in the 80s and 90s was spent tracking through the development of these kind of technologies, conventional forms of drawing that emerge alongside new formal attitudes about architecture. Architects' information processing activities are recorded through various kinds of documents. The sketches, the drawings, the models that embed themselves within the design processes as the memory structures, literally the memory structures of a project as it's being developed. One of the earliest and most influential statements about a kind of continuous surface project in the 1990s, this famous diagram by OMA in 1991 of their Yokohama proposal, which created effectively a spreadsheet across an existing parking lot in Yokohama and said, look, we don't need to build you a new building. You simply need to reorganize over the course of any given week all of the different activities that can take place there already and call it a piece of architecture. Parametrics has become a buzzword in contemporary design cultures for one simple reason. Today's new operating environments and modeling applications have been built quite literally as parametric systems, inherently linking at all times every element within these kind of modeling worlds. So each of the elements, as they're changing across this animation, are being controlled because they've all been linked to one another initially when that model is being created within this kind of a system. Parameters within a contemporary digital modeling application are nothing more than values that relate two or more discrete or independent elements within a modeling world. Parameters, like the concept of a declared variable within a computer program that this concept is implicitly linked to, is conceptually important for the ways in which it naturalizes for architects and other designers now a world of continuities and multiplicities rather than discrete objects or self-contained forms. So every element within these models, as you all know that use these kind of systems, is being controlled at all times, whether the designer is interested in it or not, by the underlying kind of programming languages that these kind of graphic spaces are being built around. An example of one of the kind of scripts that runs through these. Now, the other interesting aspect of these systems, of course, and this is the kind of photograph I use to scare new students with in some of these technologies, a typical month's reading of what it means to run a latest release of Maya or Rhino. These are systems that are themselves built around networks as their enabling device. These aren't tools for individual architects to be using. Therefore, individual designers sitting within much larger teams, which together collectively can perform the kind of operations that make all of these kind of technologies possible. It's a very different kind of sensibility than the history of architectural tools built around individual sets of hands, eyes, or minds. The famous picture of Frank Lloyd Wright every morning at 8 o'clock sharpening his pencil like a surgeon to start work, something that Frank and only Frank could do within the office. Even the apprentices weren't allowed to do it. Is a very different situation than a situation like this in which the 3 or 4 members of this design team are working in real time across the same file being linked through a system in which the tool now, by design, is distributing design across that group. A third kind of form, what you could call distributional form, is tied directly to this kind of emergent system. These are a couple of network diagrams only to make one quick point here, which is simply that what we call networks aren't all the same things. The difference between the kind of networks that are used as the backbone of an internet versus that of the freeway system in the States is an emerging science today. Centralized nodal points that distribute a certain kind of information differently than the much more linear forms of traffic that occupy things are one reason why so many different kinds of networks are being designed, developed, and now the basis for an entirely new science of networks. As Manuel Castells, the noted sociologist of today's networked global economies, has written, networks are perhaps the defining technology of globalization. Networks increasingly shape, and many fear rule, our lives. It's hardly surprising in the kind of new formalisms of architecture today to find networks becoming literally embodied in the kind of organization of structure and space that architects refer to as buildings. Suddenly buildings start to resemble in uncanny ways the roadways that they sit next to. A couple of examples of this sort of phenomena within our own studios in London. These strange models operating more as interactive networks than stable representational models, in which structures or spaces are being configured as an intelligent wiring together of individual elements or pieces. As several of this afternoon's speakers convincingly showed already today, there has been, of course, a compelling prehistory of computational approaches to parametric design within architecture, where what we could call the computers used by architecture, the actual material of models or prototypes doing work in the finding of form, This first example is a well-known one of the kind of chain models that Gaudí used as the basis for finding form in his structures, the hanging of chains that would distribute forces through a model that would find and stabilize a form that was then inverted to become the Sagrada Familia. After that, the kind of analog computational model of someone like Frei Otto, who's that figure in the center of the picture. This is his Munich Olympic Stadium project in the early 1970s, from 1972, in which the structural performance of that structure is being analyzed in this strange array of cameras put around the model as weights are being applied to the model. This was before the era of structural software, where you could just run through the numbers. This is an example of a model actually performing a form of computation and finding form itself. Many other examples within modernism. Tatlin's famous monument, the Soviet Revolution in the early 20th century, a large-scale one-to-one working prototype of a structure. The conception of space, structure, and form as a continuous field or material extends beyond architecture into many other modern experiments and innovations. The idea of space as a kind of continuous field of force is embodied in these kind of strange structures. In the early 20th century, in the 1960s, an artist like Robert Morris develops a theory of sculptural form, not as a separate idea from the material he works with, but what he says literally is the outcome of the material itself doing the work. His famous felt pieces within his studio in 1969 in New York, in which the final result is that of him nailing the material to the wall, letting gravity do the work, and him arriving at a final sculptural form. What's most interesting about those examples today, of course, is to see them in the light of our own actual working spaces, where networks and the distribution of information are now being structured in new ways. In this kind of an example, the cabling diagrams that are used to distribute, in this case, electricity and air in a typical office floor of an architect's building. So a final form, what you could call collaborative form, or the making of prototypes as an approach to architecture. A photograph I took in 2001 before an exhibition we did in which a series of prototypes are being tested by one of our consultants prior to their installation in a gallery space. What strikes me about this is the way in which design activities are moving away from a traditional desktop setting into a one-to-one working prototype of architectural space itself. Again, I think something that has a very deep and interesting history within architecture. I'd like to draw attention to a growing shift away from architectural form as an application of a fixed outcome or a known model or type, whether that of historical examples or that of rigid predefined design methods, and look towards instead the unexpected but controlled outcomes of carefully contained forms of design research and open experimentation. And as I stressed earlier, I think there's plenty of examples we could look at of this prototype-making sensibility within architecture. The Eames on the right side here in the 1950s being a classic example in which ideas of form are really just the outcome of them experimenting for years and years with what they called their Kazan machine that would bend plywood in unexpected ways. And as they mastered that technology, mastered the kind of formal consequences of their own interest. Another example that I think many people know, the strange form-making prototypes of Buckminster Fuller, who never actually even had a studio, who went around the world, and certainly to most of the architecture schools in the States, bankrupting them by the building of these large-scale dome structures in which he worked out the ideas of his tensegrity structures. In Europe, a great example of this sort of prototype sensibility is the office of Jean Prouvé in the 1930s to the 1950s, who, as his first major investment within the office, doesn't hire staff or people, but buys a vast machine whose only purpose is the bending of sheet metal. This is it. Which he then thought he could build an office or an attitude of architecture around. As he mastered the bending of aluminum and other lightweight materials, he formed the basis for formal ideas themselves in his own work. I think a picture you all probably know. Does everybody recognize? In the lower left, Bill Gates. and on the right, his teacher in high school, Paul Allen, who developed a company called Microsoft. Today, what we call R&D is a defining feature of all advanced industrial and post-industrial economies. Governments, industries, companies are all wedded to an immense and continuous investment in research and the research of new products, ideas, and designs. As Bill Gates said once about Microsoft, and this is the image that floats around the internet that almost always has as its subject line, would you have invested in this company in 1978? You got to admit, I mean, looking at some of these pictures, it's sort of staggering. But as Bill Gates says, his interest isn't in the creation of an individual product or a prototype. It's in the creating of a learning structure, a form of learning as an organization that would allow Microsoft to continually evolve in an industry that itself is continually evolving. It was a brilliant business plan, and it worked up until the day in which Google surpassed its own limits. I'm interested in the way in which architectural learning can be pursued through the making of prototypes to conceive, develop, and test architectural ideas. One of the most interesting features of the AA school, I think, is the way in which we've built the place entirely around the making of prototypes. The AA in the 1970s got together, had a vote, and threw out the idea of curriculum in architecture. We have no fixed curriculum. We're 700 people organized into about 30 programs that do nothing but make projects and figure we're going to learn something from it and go on to a next project. So I thought I would just show you a few images of what some of those prototypes look like today from some of our current tutors. This is the work of a recent diploma unit. Some of it's very strange. There's a lot of models attached to the ceiling for some reason in the building. They're getting a bit bigger these days. We've got 300 acres out in the forest in West Dorset, so we're doing more and more of this sort of larger scale testing of prototypes. But it's also something that's been going on for many, many years at a place like the A, not just with our students and staff, but also with visitors. This is Coop Himmelblau, when they were still a couple of hippies in the late 70s and early 80s, coming and testing their first large-scale installation in Bedford Square out in front of the school. Jean Hayduk, after years, is one of maybe the world's great educators in architecture. His first building project at the AA, a little commission he was given in 1982 to build a tower. But again, a sort of working prototype in which the work we do within a studio is the learning and testing from the actual making of a thing rather than a representation. A much cooler, more recent example, this is Sajima when we brought her to Europe for a first English-speaking setting to show her work from Japan. One of my students from a couple of years ago carrying this sensibility forward in one of our end-of-year shows. It's actually a surface built out of hundreds of Chinese noodle lids linked together to create a kind of continuous surface. This idea of a continuous surface is something that's been running through the A for many years. This is a prototype that Zaha Hadid built 2 years ago at the AA, where she's rolling a surface from a floor up onto a wall into a ceiling. And I think for me, one of the interesting things about it is the way in which it relates back to something she was doing in the place 25 years before. That's her in the polka dots. But if you can see in the picture, the interesting thing is, again, when given an opportunity to exhibit work, what's being done, if you can see in that superimposed image on the upper right, is the installation of a prototype. And in fact, it's the same obsession that 25 years later we put back into the building, which is this idea of how a continuous surface can roll through an organized space in different ways than rooms that are made up of discrete planes and elements. That's a floor rolling up to become the backdrop of an exhibition of her diploma unit in 1983. This prototyping sensibility runs in many other venues outside a place like the AA, and I think one of our jobs today is to try and resurrect someone like Frank Gehry and make him viable or interesting at his advanced age. And I think one way you can do that is to be reminded of incredible devotion to prototyping of his own work and ideas. His house in Venice in California, which he starts working on in the early 70s, in fact, he never finishes and continually rebuilds and rearranges as a way for him to learn some of the ideas about how it is he wants to develop architecture. He built his early career around this forgotten material, cheap cardboard used at the scale of entire buildings, rooms, and furniture, which he did for years. This prototyping sensibility can be found throughout architectural modernism in figures like this. Mies especially was incredibly devoted to the making of prototypes as a way to advance architectural form and knowledge. In fact, this is a one-to-one model of one of his villas, in which he puts, even though the thing is inside, it's still got a roof. I mean, it's a very strange simulation of an architectural project. On the left, maybe the most famous modern architectural project of all, in fact, was nothing but a working prototype built to last 6 months during a world exposition in Barcelona. We can look outside architecture to fields like filmmaking. This is a young George Lucas in the middle of his Star Wars world in the early 1980s. In fact, a studio filled with nothing but prototypes whose behaviors, characters, ideas, attitudes becomes the storytelling basis for his films. And what for me then maybe becomes the summation of this in the architect's configuration of his or her own body, what starts to matter isn't the shape or the appearance of a body, as someone like Korb imagined in the 1950s with his modular system, in which bodies were so stable and fixed that they could be measured and a formula developed to be applied across all humanity and his own buildings. But in fact, the critique that someone like John Travolta offers in the 1970s, in which it's the performance of bodies, the performativity of form, and form is the outcome of movement, and he was a great mover at the time, that becomes the model for how it is architects now operate in these increasingly complex kind of spaces. This is a separate lecture, but it's the maybe let's say the critique of him is certainly this famous supermodel who today on her carbon fiber extensions is now blending the organic and inorganic in ways in which even those forms of movement are being confounded by a continuing escalation of new technologies. It's a picture of a cow in front of the painting. This is a Mark Tansey photograph, a painting, if you all know it. And the point I wanted to make here was really the shift in these kind of systems away from forms of representation and a realistic depiction of the world as we think we see it in these kind of classical forms, which is being parodied in this famous painting by Mark Tansey 10 years ago, to the arrival, let's say, of simulation models in which the simulation of information, as many people have written, and it was commented upon in some of this afternoon's sessions, is overtaking reality itself. This is the aggregate polling of George Bush's popularity in the years after 9/11 aligned with key events, the emergence of the Iraq War, etc. This shift from representation to a world of flowing information in which the simulation of that information becomes its own kind of incredibly important and influential form. I put it in today because the polls yesterday said one person was going to win in New Hampshire, and in fact, when those models go wrong, it's staggering. It's staggering to see what the effects are. So a final section here, just a few comments to end with. I'd like to end by turning from formalism per se, or at least that associated with objects, networks, or outcomes of architectural projects, to something I take to be more important as an architectural entity, the organization of design worlds through which architects inevitably pursue their work. These are the settings the design teams and system used in our work where architects actually learn to learn. For obvious reasons, this is perhaps the most important kind of architectural formalism of all, that of the form we take when pursuing design activities themselves. For decades, the pedagogical and professional habits by which architects have worked and have been taught have undergone very little real change. This is surprising when you think about it, given how much the bigger world around architecture has itself changed. This is a picture of architecture as it was being taught at the factory for the production of Mies at IIT in Chicago, which in fact is still very much the dominant model of architecture schools around the world today, in which you can see every architect takes the same pose. I mean, they were actually trained to emulate Mies in incredible ways. Tables are aligned in columns and rows, like the pages of a book. And it's a kind of pedagogical model that, in fact, is run throughout architecture for the better part of a century. The new and sometimes strange ways in which architects and other work environments now configure themselves into ever more complex, fluid, and often very messy ways is not a condition unique to architecture. We should remember this today, I think, and in fact it can be sometimes surprising to see other new professions emulate our own. One of my favorite examples, this is one of Bill Gates' programming teams in Microsoft in Redmond, California, basically living like your average architecture studio anywhere around the world. The blurring of living and working, the mixing of workstations with the individual programmers, and these little kind of self-contained worlds. In another example, here's a photo I like to show my architecture students of another creative field that's gone through this transformation, the field of contemporary music. Music has lived through the arrival of electricity, networks, and all kinds of new electronic compositional systems literally decades ago. If you remember, the original electrification of instruments was the basis for the invention of rock and roll, electric guitars. And it took a generation or two before people like Jimi Hendrix come along and take things like the feedback system that electric guitars create to, in fact, invent new forms of music. New forms of music occur within music in other ways. On the left is your kind of classic ambient musician today, living in one of his parents' bedrooms, inhabiting a space in which the difference between instruments, networks, space, sound, recording, all gets blurred together into one continuous field, quite literally. He's the progeny, really, of these kind of people. In the upper right, Steve Reich from the 1960s. On the left, the back of Brian Eno's famous discrete music album of 1975, which invented what we all call today ambient music. And in fact, Eno was so proud of it that he put the diagram of how he organized the different electronic instruments that produced his sound on the back cover and said, that's it, that's all the music is. He got in trouble with his record label when they asked for an album. He set that machine up, and as he said, turned it on, let it start running, went in the other room, made a cup of tea, came back 3 hours later, had a ton of music. It was done. Eno accidentally invents ambient music out of the reconfiguration of his own skills and knowledge of music across these new kind of platforms. How architects connect their working spaces to the larger world is now an entirely new kind of formal pursuit in architecture. This is one of my teams quite literally reconnecting themselves to the outside world for the sole purpose of stealing broadband internet from our neighbors 5 years ago. The AA isn't one of the wealthiest institutions in the world, and we happen to be located next door to a company called Imagination, which had the highest bandwidth in Europe at the time, and supported the office for the better part of a year. One of my young teachers in Los Angeles I was with a couple of years ago offers another example of this strange blurring of studios now with a larger outside world. This is the only place Yuska could find good wireless reception at a motel we were staying in Beverly Hills. The loading dock became the kind of studio space for the week that he and his students worked across. Even within the more traditional conceptions of the studio, where we can claim form starts and stops in familiar ways, this increasing connectivity between ourselves as designers and that outside world even confounds those structures. So even when you can get your design team together, this is Yasha in the left corner there, if you can see him, with his teammates basically in another place and time entirely, regardless of whether they were physically together in that space or not at the moment of that tutorial. The larger world out there, beyond the architect's studio, is of course a final and profound new context by which to judge a recent return to formalism in architecture. Last image I'll show tonight. The industrialization of form making itself is obviously all around us today, as an essential and undeniable aspect of the current and massive wave of new building construction and urbanization, quite literally the greatest wave of new building and urbanization ever encountered in human history, right? In the proliferation of new cities like this, 200 million people being relocated within China over a 20-year period, which provides another backdrop for proliferation of form-making. As Italo Calvino once wrote, we can reasonably expect to enjoy a proliferation of new form until the end of cities themselves. Never has Calvino's sentiment seemed more real and certainly more architecturally tangible than it is today. Calvino wrote it the following way. This is Calvino. The catalog of forms is endless. Until every shape has found its city, new cities will continue to be born. When the forms exhaust their variety and come apart, the end of cities begin. From the perspective of architecture's contemporary rediscovery of and sustained interest in form itself, following on from Calvino's observation, it would appear that there are still many new cities yet to be born, most of which have yet to be imagined, but all of which are already somewhere out there, traveling across networks, simply waiting for architects to capture them. Thank you very much. Describe it not so much as a collaborative work organizations aren't so much an answer to anything as they are a kind of lived reality today in ways that are maybe slightly different than they have been in the past with architecture. I think I could do a separate talk that would show the way in which today's collaborative structures are actually part of quite a deep history of collaborative thinking and innovation that's defined architecture. Architecture traditionally, or as we know, modern architecture is traditionally described in terms of a few key and singular personalities, and we all know who those are. But one of its most interesting features is, in fact, the way in which modern architectural ideas are carried forward by groups of people. Much of that history is suppressed with our fascination with individuals, and I think even the collaborative structures of offices like OMA today tend to be suppressed by the presence of one particular individual. But I think that collaborative aspect of the way architects have lived and worked for a very long time is the necessary precondition to explain why today's collaborative experimentation has taken off as quickly and as deeply as it has. In fact, it was a very easy switch to make. And I think, as a few people wrote today about, or presented today about the sort of pre-digital aspects of formalism that can be found in this country, let's say in the 1960s or 70s, that prehistory is in fact one way to explain how it is the digital revolution of the last 15 years has swept across creative fields of all kinds so quickly. Because in fact a series of stages had already been gone through that preconditioned that ground. Offices like SOM, Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, the American corporate giant, used to be the world's biggest architect. It's not now. It's actually a fairly small concern. Reorganized architectural design activities deliberately in the 1950s around 15 or 20 different specialties that projects would flow through. And that modular structure of thinking, in fact, which is derived from all kinds of managerial theories, corporate organizational models, is in fact the model that things like collaborative tools and systems are themselves being built around today. The one couldn't have happened, I think, without the other having been already put in place. So I wouldn't in any way argue for collaborative working or thinking as a form of answer to anything. It's simply an increasing and inevitable reality of how it is we all now work. I've shown a few extreme examples today, but I think we all know much more everyday, smaller, closer examples that we all live through in our ordinary lives. The interesting thing is that these are systems designed deliberately and only to be able to work through collaborative settings. These are tools that literally, to master them, requires that you're working in vast groups of people who can take on different aspects of work and then integrate that work within your own. That's the real shift today, and it's one of the most interesting ones for all of us to try and negotiate. Anything else? It's been a long day. I don't want to keep you on.
Shortly, can you elaborate about the movement, the third image of the movement you said, the John Travolta image? Really interested in how it related to architecture or to
the blending of organic and inorganic systems. Yeah, I didn't talk about it too much tonight, but I think the striking feature of this network distributed setting through which design thinking flows today is that it really is a very strange assemblage of organic stuff like us, like agency, and deliberately inorganic systems like hard drives, hubs, servers that contain and collect information that we then are continually accessing and adding to and modifying. I think it's in the limited scope of today's discussion around really just questions of design and the formal aspects of design. I think that's probably the one I'd point to. I think there are other ones we can talk about, which is the kind of work that people are doing today on biological forms of building, the kind of growing of structures rather than the building of them, which lots of people are working on. But that's sort of outside of the scope of tonight's.
I want to ask why. What is I understand the subject and the progress and everything. What is the motivation of this progress? Why? Where are we going?
For me, the why would probably lie along the lines of saying that it's this proliferation of new technologies that simply provide a different kind of context today for asking the kind of questions we've long been trained to do within architecture. I think we are living through the birth of entirely new kinds of media today, which sometimes seem very strange and different than the stuff we somehow already have built within the discipline. I don't think that's the case so much. I think if you look back at the history of modernism, for example, I think that the interesting figures are people like Mies, let's say, who in the 19-teens and in the early 20s appropriates an entirely new medium like photography to say it should be the basis for him to rethink what architecture or form can be. Mies deliberately stops drawing and says, look, this photography thing is very strange. It might provide a means for me to think through space and structure that can do work on those already existing forms I'm deeply interested in. And that's effectively what he does. Mies appropriates and begins a career through the manipulation quite directly of entirely new and strange forms of media. Photography is one, and Mies becomes obsessed with making a very large-scale, quite literal one-to-one images of buildings before they exist. Most famously, I think, it is New York exhibition at the moment, 46, where he just one-to-one photographs of Mies's world becomes the exhibition. But he also does something else which is quite strange. He turns modeling, if you remember his skyscraper model in Berlin in 1917, he builds that out of steel and glass. He says the only way I can understand these new strange things is to actually work with them as a material. And so he's the kind of person I think you could look to say there's quite deeply within a discipline like modern architecture an interest in the experimentation with new technologies and media as a way to not profoundly change, but certainly innovate within the existing forms that already exist in the discipline. That's what I would say is the aspect of today's much stranger kinds of new media that are proliferating all around us. Things like animation, which I didn't really show any of tonight, or the kind of new synthetic materials that are coming out of these sort of arrangements, kind of carbon fibers and graphites and stuff that people are just sort of starting to
make use of.
I don't think it's because these sort of things provide some sort of an ultimate answer. They simply provide a very real context for us today to confront those things that are already quite deeply embedded within the discourses, the profession, the knowledge that we call architecture already. I think they're the ways that we actually do work on architecture. Which isn't to say those other technologies somehow don't matter. It's not like we all don't use pencils or pens. But that those kind of activities now sit within certainly an expanded space of other kinds of media and technologies that those activities occur with.
One last question.
Yeah, with all this say, instantaneous collaboration that can happen with those people in different places, where one can really split a process up into different parts. And somehow, there has to be some kind of management that chooses what of that collaboration happens. People think about different things and go different directions, and then there has to be a guiding hand that chooses. No one can understand it all, but they have to sort of mold this thing and capture the moment, capture the form, capture it before it can go on into it. Now, where does that come in? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a really good observation. It's absolutely the case, and that's part of the reason I'm so interested in it in a pedagogical setting. It took us 2 years in negotiation with our validating authorities before we could even create a collaborative studio in which we said, at the end of that 16-month period, we could award an individual architect a degree in architecture, even though they've never worked individually. I mean, for some reason, even though this has been built into sciences and other disciplines literally for decades, architects have a hard time with the idea. Now, it's precisely the ambiguity of how it is that you then control that knowledge and information that, for me, becomes such an interesting learning exercise. I think not at necessarily every stage of someone's education, but certainly at a kind of postgraduate level, for me, I was very interested in the idea of putting a bunch of people from different parts of the world together and saying, okay, everybody, sort it out. Now, the difficulty is, like for teachers, it turns you into a marriage counselor a huge part of the year. And I mean it quite seriously. Like, people have fights. I teach in a school where 90% of our students come from 60 different countries every year. It's an extremely international setting where ordinary communication is a challenge to begin with, but then when you make them work together, it becomes... But it's precisely that negotiation which I think is an incredible learning experience. The point you're making is that basically all forms of architectural activity occur this way anyway. There are one-person offices, but even that one person ends up collaborating with an immense array of consultants, clients, managers, etc., etc. So that's just social life. And I think that the idea that we can embed that back into learning or educational settings, for me, is I think one of the next great challenges for architecture. We certainly don't have any answer. I can put up a million examples of teams like Crashing and Burning, with 4 gifted individuals, but strange chemistry, dynamic. I can do the opposite. I can take what we used to call the loser teams, people that nobody wanted, who get put together, who actually do the most spectacular, unimaginable leaps possible. And it basically just becomes like life, as I see it.
One comment about this, like in the end, it's personalities, quote-unquote superstars. And how does anybody, like Frank Gehry, organize 100 people, come out with something that actually looks like something, and everybody does the same relationship, but how does he control it? How could he possibly do it? It's a personality. It's a human aspect in the end. So through all those impossible unquantifiable things, and the piece happens. And their talent of human communication, skill of interpersonal communications. It's all electronics makes it happen.
It happens. The electronic proliferation makes that sort of thing happen in different ways, but I think the point you're drawing to is that in fact it always has happened within working structures of any kind. It's simply that that's a slightly different terrain these days. It's certainly not one that makes it any easier from our experiment, but it's certainly one that foregrounds the reality much more than conventional structures of how you teach and learn. Like for me, the great thing about being a teacher with a group of 4 people working together is that whatever I say is immediately being understood in 4 different ways. I can't even, you can't say something that 4 people will understand the same way. And that's, of course, what makes it, as a teacher, a much, much more interesting situation than a traditional modern one that I think you see embodied in the work of someone like Mises' IIT in the 30s and 40s.
Okay, thank you.